So we are going to go straight over to Richard Heinberg, speaking on the clean energy shift. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. Ties in very well with what we've heard from Claire and Daniel so far. So Richard is the author of 13 books, and he's now the senior fellow in residence of the Post-Carbon Institute. Richard is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. And he has authored scores of essays and articles, delivered hundreds of lectures on energy and climate issues to audiences in over 14 countries, addressing policymakers at many levels, from local city councils to members of the European Parliament. Richard has been quoted and interviewed for many times in print, television, radio, appearing in film and television documentaries, including Leonardo DiCaprio's 11th Hour. And he is the recipient of the M. King Hubbert Award for Excellence in Energy Education. And even was appointed to His Majesty the King of Bhutan's International Expert Working Group for the New Development Paradigm Initiative in 2012. So I have a feeling we're going to hear from a very interesting character here, and I'm going to give the talking stick over to you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. Well, we're going to be talking for the next 40 minutes about energy. And so it's important that we, how do I get my slides to change? There we go, maybe just a little lag. It's important that we understand some basic things about energy to start with. First of all, energy is everything. We literally cannot do anything without energy. And having more energy at our fingertips means we can do more stuff. This is recent world history of energy. And as you can see, in 1800, most of our non-food energy came from what this calls traditional biofuels, but in most cases constituted firewood. And we still use just as much firewood as we did in 1800, actually even more of it. But we've added all of these other energy sources, including coal, crude oil, natural gas, hydropower, nuclear, wind, solar, and other renewables. And so we've increased the amount of energy available to us quite dramatically. And that has changed how we live. And it's changed not only how we live, but how many of us are living. In 1800, there were a little fewer than 1 billion humans on the planet. Today, there are almost 8 billion. Well, what changed? Well, obviously, industrial agriculture, applying fossil fuels to growing food, which also included turning fossil fuels into fertilizers. It also included making medicines out of fossil fuels, sanitation chemicals, and so on. So it's pretty fair to say that there are 7 billion human beings alive today who wouldn't be here without fossil fuels. But fossil fuels, of course, have two problems. They're non-renewable, which means as we extract them from the ground and burn them once and for all, we're depleting them. And the other problem, of course, is that burning them pollutes air and water and soil, most famously and no doubt most critically via climate change. We're changing the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's oceans. We're running history's biggest chemistry experiment, and we don't know how it will turn out. So we know that we have to stop using fossil fuels one way or another, sooner or later, and taking climate change into account, the sooner the better. So here's news from the Energy Information Administration. They're projecting that by 2050, renewables will, that's mostly solar and wind energy, will grow pretty substantially. The bad news is by 2050, we should be off of fossil fuels altogether. And that's not the track that we're on. This is sort of the business as usual, you know, just extrapolating out current trends in what's happening with each of these energy sources. But it actually gets worse because this is just electricity. And electricity is only 20% of all the energy that we use. So the other 80% we use in transportation, aviation, and car and truck fuels, ship oil for shipping, natural gas for heating, for industry, for manufacturing, for agriculture, all of these other things. So how is this transition going to happen? What will be required? What will it look like? To a large degree, we don't really know. We don't even have a good pilot project of, let's say, a medium-sized industrial city that's already been transitioned to run entirely on renewable energy. When we hear about, say, a country that's running on renewable energy, typically what that means is that their electricity system is almost entirely from renewable sources. And as we just saw, that's only 20% of all energy. So it's what we have in front of us is an enormous task, certainly the biggest in all of human history. One of the challenges that we have in transitioning to renewable sources of energy is that they're intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So there are workarounds for that. One is energy storage. Batteries, of course, are one way of storing energy, but they're probably the least efficient way of storing energy. Another workaround is source redundancy, just building way more solar panels and wind turbines than we'll actually need at any one given moment, and then connecting them all through some kind of super grid. The third is demand management. So we change our usage patterns so they fit the sources better. Now that's actually the cheapest and most effective way of dealing with source intermittency, but it's the one that we pay the least attention to because we want to use energy when we want to use it, right? We're modern industrial people after all, and we deserve to have our needs met at any time and place. Well, this is what intermittency looks like. And as you can see, there is hourly intermittency, there's daily intermittency, and seasonal intermittency. Batteries do a good job with hourly and daily diurnal intermittency, but they don't do such a good, if you need to store energy for say 3 months or 6 months, not so good. So we have to figure out something else. Another problem is that we've built all of our energy using infrastructure to suit the characteristics of the energy sources that we had, which were fossil fuels, right? So everything from our transportation technologies to our manufacturing technologies and all the rest, you know, we built them to work with fossil fuels. And so how are we going to transition all of that infrastructure to work with renewable sources of energy like solar and wind? Well, one way would be to electrify everything so that manufacturing all runs on electricity, transportation all runs on electricity, and so on. Well, in some cases, that's reasonably easy, like with electric cars. I've driven an electric car for years. They work great. I love electric cars. They're certainly not a full solution because building cars takes an enormous amount of energy and materials and so on, but it certainly can be done. Another easy thing we can do is switch to air source heat pumps or mini split systems to replace natural gas furnaces and regular air conditioners. These are much more efficient. And of course, they run on electricity. Again, great thing, had them in our home for years. Others are going to be more difficult. The construction industry, what do we use for construction? Materials like concrete and steel. Making those materials is very energy intensive. And the way we do it now, this is a cement kiln. Cement is the key ingredient in concrete. Concrete is like the foundation of modern industrial civilization. And if you want to know where the economy is growing, just look at where concrete is being used, which for the past few decades has been China. Cement kilns operate at like 1700 degrees Celsius. And, you know, could you run one of these things on electricity? Conceivably, yes, but it would be like 3-4 times as expensive. So yeah, maybe we continue using concrete and it's 3 or 4 times as expensive. Maybe we find substitute materials. Maybe we just stop using that kind of building material altogether. Any way you look at it, it's an enormous shift. Aviation. Yeah, we might be able to have short run flights with not that many passengers running on electricity, on batteries. But for the most part, aviation just doesn't fit with the renewable energy future. It may be one of the things that we basically have to give up. Then there's plastics. You know, all of these plastics we make with fossil fuels, they're horrific for the environment. Future generations are going to be dealing with the legacy of our plastics for a long, long time to come. They're just incredibly polluting. Well, we can make bioplastics and they're getting better, but in most cases, there are trade-offs in terms of cost or performance. Then there's consumer electronics. This is, you know, I worked with a colleague at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory who's in their energy assessment program. And we worked for a year to try to figure out how this energy transition would work in really practical, down to earth ways. And when we came to consumer electronics, it was just like, you know, stumbling on a tree stump in the path. We couldn't figure out any way to make this work without fossil fuels. So sorry, I just don't have anything to suggest there. Kind of the same thing with international shipping. There is some experimentation going on with sails. And that reduces fuel usage by up to 2/3, maybe even a shade more if they come up with better designs. But the other 33% is still bunker oil for shipping. Resource extraction. These machines could be run on electricity. It is possible. I mean, if you imagine in this picture up at the top of the photo, some wind turbines sitting on the top of that hill with cables running down to these machines, it could work. But that's not how we're doing it now. So we basically need to replace all the infrastructure we're using for resource extraction. I mean, all this comes down to cases. You know, look around you at everything in your room, in the room you're sitting in right now. All of it was produced either with fossil fuels or transported to where it is using fossil fuels. This is just an analysis that was done on blue jeans a few years ago. CO2 emissions from one pair of blue jeans is equal to the carbon sequestered by 6 trees annually. Okay, so this means we're going to have to change the way we live on a daily basis, our expectations, not just what we buy, but how much we consume. Now, here's another workaround: low carbon fuels. You could take energy from electricity from solar and wind and use it to electrolyze water and extract the hydrogen from the water. It's a very energy intensive process, not very efficient, but it's a way of getting hydrogen, which is, you know, very versatile, very useful. You could store the hydrogen. It's not very easily stored. It's a very small molecule. It tends to leak. So you don't want to store it very long, but it's possible. You can take that hydrogen, you could combine it with carbon from the atmosphere. You know, you could build machines to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, combine it with the hydrogen, and produce synthetic fuels that you could use to power aircraft, for example. If we still want to have an airline industry, this is one way you could run it. Problem is, again, this is very expensive and energy inefficient, but also you would need to build a whole new energy infrastructure just to do this thing. And the size of the infrastructure, if we were going to do it at scale to run commercial aviation, industrial agriculture, and other things that are hard to electrify, the scale that we would need would rival the size of our current oil and gas industry. So again, it's all of these things are possible in the laboratory. It's when you try to scale them up to the size of our current energy system, the amount of energy that we're currently using, that's when the challenges really start to appear. Here's another challenge, producing all of this new infrastructure, not just solar panels and wind turbines, but new technology for manufacturing and transportation, the electric cars and all the rest. All of this requires energy. And since 85% of our energy currently comes from fossil fuels, if we need to build all of that new infrastructure in the next 20 years, that means that the energy transition itself will result in a huge pulse of carbon emissions, just the thing we're trying to avoid. Well, that's a little disheartening. How do you avoid that? Well, the only way is to reduce our energy usage while we're making the transition, reduce the energy that we're using for transportation, manufacturing, home heating, and all these other things, so that we don't have to build as much infrastructure. Okay. So are we on the path now to making this transition successfully? Well, no. This is the pace of renewables investment over the last 15 years or so, 17 years. And as you can see, we kind of leveled off around 2014. It hasn't been growing that much since then. So looking at our current pace of investment, it would have to increase to between 5 and 10 times what it is now, if we were to have any hope of building all of that infrastructure by the middle of the century. So it's not happening now. What do we stand to lose if we don't do this successfully? Well, solar and wind produce electricity, and there are a lot of drawbacks with solar and wind, and there are people who are writing more and more about those drawbacks. There was a movie produced a while ago by Jeff Gibbs that looked at the drawbacks of renewable energy, and a book that just came out called Bright Green Lies by Derek Jensen and others. And they look at the resource extraction and the amount of land that's required and so on. And it's, if we try to use renewable energy to do what we're doing now at the current scale, it's going to be pretty bad. But on the other hand, if we give up electricity altogether, we've electrified basically all human knowledge, science, music, art, medicine. If the grid goes down, all of that goes away and billions of people die. So we have a huge incentive to make at least some of this work with renewable energy, to keep it going to the extent that we possibly can. Let's look at just one area, which is, kind of near and dear to our hearts, most of us, which is food. Eating food is good, but our industrial food system is inherently unsustainable. And any of you who have been around the sustainability discussion for very long know all of this stuff. I mean, it's well understood. I'm not going to read it to you. You can just glance at it yourselves, all of those points. And our food system is very energy dependent. We use about 12 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce one final calorie of food energy that we eat at the table. that would never have worked in any previous civilization because food was their major source of energy. So food production had to be an energy positive activity, not an energy negative activity. We've gotten used to producing food by basically shoveling energy into the ground and forcing plants to grow up from destroyed soil. And it works up to a point. But without cheap energy, cheap, abundant energy, it's not going to work. So we need to change our food system. And if we do, we could do it in a way that actually has some side benefits, some significant ones for human health, for the environment, and so on. But what we need to do, of course, is reduce the amount of meat that we're eating, reduce and eventually, or as soon as possible, eliminate chemical fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides, reduce processing and packaging, and localize our food systems to reduce transport. If we do it right, we can sequester carbon in the soil. Carbon farming is a new term that's entered the sustainability lexicon in the last 5 or 10 years. And this statement by Rattan Lal may be an overstatement. He may have overestimated the amount of possible sequestration, but nevertheless, it's significant. And it's a heck of a lot better than trying to suck carbon out of the atmosphere using big machines. This paper here, you see, Assessing Carbon Capture. If you're interested in this subject, this is the best overview paper that's been written to date. And it's devastating. I mean, I know there's some well-meaning scientists at Harvard and MIT and so on who are working on direct air capture. And again, it works in the laboratory, but it's extremely energy intensive, which kind of defeats the purpose in the first place. And there's no market for the carbon that's captured. It's extremely inefficient. We'd be much better off using biological means of capturing carbon from the atmosphere and using pyrolysis, which is kind of the same process we use for making charcoal. Maybe you've heard of biochar. It's a way of increasing soil fertility while storing carbon in the soil. But pyrolysis could also be used for making materials that incorporate carbon that we could use in building construction, road construction, et cetera, et cetera. As we do all of this, we need to be thinking about energy equity. When policymakers talk and think about this stuff, they assume that people who are using a lot of energy now are going to continue using just as much energy, which means people in North America, and especially rich middle-class people in North America. But in fact, you know, there are a lot of people in the world who are using a tiny, tiny fraction of what North Americans use. And they actually need to upgrade their energy usage using renewable energy, while folks in the global North need to reduce their energy usage pretty dramatically. The Global Footprint Network tracks, you know, how much of Earth's resources we're actually using. And we're using a planet and a half's worth of resources now. How's that even possible? By drawing down resources that would otherwise be available to future generations. If everybody lived at the European standard, we'd need 2.5 planets. If everybody lived at the US standard, we would need more than 4 planets. Well, guess what? We only have 1. So that means we're going to have to reduce total consumption. And for people in relatively wealthy countries, we're going to have to reduce consumption pretty dramatically. And this obviously means giving up the idea of economic growth, which is one of the greatest planning failures, the greatest planning failure in the history of our species. The idea that we should incorporate the need for continuous growth in consumption into the very structure of our economy. It's called consumerism. And we've built it over the last few decades, and it's a catastrophe. Another name for it is capitalism, but sometimes I prefer the name consumerism. you can't continue growing anything, any physical quantity forever. And by trying to do that with the economy, we're simply hastening the prospect of civilizational collapse. Growth makes all climate solutions harder. And so the folks, well-meaning folks who try to come up with things like green growth as a solution to climate change are really just fudging the issue. We have to get past the idea of economic growth as a good thing. And that's a real paradigm shift. That's a true global shift. If you want to make a difference in climate, in the global climate, these are ways of doing it. Having one fewer child in your lifetime is the biggest thing you can do. Living car-free is the next, and you can go on down the line. But as you can see, all of these have a lifestyle component. Overall, we need to use less concrete and steel, more local natural materials, more recycled materials, build at the human scale, not so much skyscrapers, more eco-villages designed for low energy operation. Our renewable future is going to have less total energy available, almost certainly. It will be less easily controllable. We will be less mobile, so we need to localize our economies more. But all of these things, if we do them well, offer us opportunities for not just an acceptable quality of life, but a happier quality of life. Obviously, a more stable climate, greatly reduced health and environmental impacts, and the prospect, the opportunity for future generations of humans to persist, which otherwise may not be the case, going the way we are now. Obviously, there are costs, changes to our behaviors and expectations, and adapting to a different kind of economy. But if we're not willing to contemplate those costs, then we won't get the benefits, and we may not be around to see the results. All of this information is available in a free book that you can download called Our Renewable Future, which I wrote with David Fridley, whom I mentioned earlier at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Just go to that website and you can read the whole thing. So that's my spiel, and I hope this is helpful to you. And I'm happy to engage with some discussions, hear some questions, and see if I can make some cogent replies.
Thank you so much, Richard. Very illuminating, and it's so fascinating to be kind of zooming out on what we talked about with Daniel. Where do we spend our energy, and what intention do we have behind spending our energy? It requires a great deal of awareness to shift the minds and hearts and actions, nonetheless, of each individual on this planet. But I think that you've provided us with a lot of facts and substance to kind of fuel our own transitions. I have some questions from the audience here.
Great.
And one interesting one is how significant has the impact of the pandemic been on energy consumption?
Well, initially it was quite significant, and it's been different in different countries. In 2020, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions definitely declined. I don't think we have a clear number yet. I've seen anywhere from 5 to 10%. So transport energy was way down. Certainly aviation transport energy just practically bottomed out in 2020. But that's coming back. So as the economy recovers, then we begin using more energy again. But the pandemic was a great learning opportunity. See, we realized over the course of a year that actually we can live without global aviation. Maybe it's hard. Some people have to give up their expectations of, flying to Venice for a vacation or whatever. I like Venice. I love Venice. I would love to see Venice again before I die. But if it means, saving the planet, I guess I'll stay home. So that's something we learned in 2020. And as I say, it's been different for different nations depending on the degree of lockdown and so on. China's economic trajectory is changing, partly as a result of the pandemic and partly a result of their national planning system. They're reducing the rate of their economic growth, which has been about 7% a year. At 7% a year, an economy doubles in size every 10 years. Think about that. How long can you do that? Not very long. So China is scaling back on economic growth, which is a very good thing, but it's just scaling back on growth. It's not reversing growth. So we have a long way to go.
We do indeed have a long way to go. It comes down to our individual life quality. I've been lucky enough to forage wild nettle today, and I feel the energy from this plant beaming in all of my cells. There was a question about deep ecology, and you mentioned quality of life also in your presentation. In what ways can we change our households and our local energy systems to promote a better solution on a wider scale?
Well, one thing you can do is grow a little bit more of your own food. And this may seem like a trivial contribution. And maybe it is, maybe you have very little space in which you can do that. And so the amount of food you can grow is literally trivial, but it changes your mindset. It helps you get back in touch with soil, the seasons, the process by which we are fed. Living in cities, as most human beings do today for the first time in all of human history, that most people have lived in cities, we are out of touch with nature. Our dependency is on cars and roads and smartphones and stores and Amazon. That's what our lives depend on, and that's what we pay attention to, right? But in the larger scheme of things, we all are still 100% dependent on the natural world. So we have to start paying more attention to that and less attention to all this human stuff. And gardening is one way to do that. So I would, even if it's not a huge contribution to your energy budget, even if it's not a big way of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, it's an important way of starting to shift your consciousness so that you're taking account of energy. Because when you're gardening, you notice how much effort it actually takes to produce food. Energy in versus energy out. That's something that people in all previous societies, whether hunter-gatherer or agrarian societies, they knew on a daily basis because it meant life or death. How much energy are you investing for how much energy payback? Well, you've got to get more energy payback for the energy that you invest. Fossil fuels just completely shifted that equation because we could get millions of years of ancient sunlight that was already pre-packaged by nature, transformed from carbohydrates in ancient seas to hydrocarbons that we could extract and use very, very cheaply and in huge quantities. And so energy investment and energy return became something we just didn't need to pay attention to. Well, we do again. We certainly do with renewable energy, and we do with food as well. Go ahead.
That's very wise. And there's a word that's been coming up a lot for me lately, and it's energy elegance. Inspired by Eastern traditions of Zen, Buddhism, and so on, the elegant flow of energy in a system And I think I can speak for many of us when I say that this is something that can be felt on our bodies, right? A lot of the diseases and disharmonies and diagnoses we get actually stem from this feeling of disturbance or disharmony in our own bodies. And guessing that when people realize that their bodies are actually almost mirrors or microcosms of what's going on in the world, you use the word to expand our consciousness also on these issues. And I feel like the language is starting to spill over between different silos and sectors. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah.
Has the language that you've been using in your work been changing over the course of your studies?
Oh, sure. Yeah. All the time. And I love your term energy elegance. That's not one that I've used before, but I'm going to start using it, because the way we do things with fossil fuels is basically energy brute force. You know, we overcome our problems just by throwing huge amounts of energy at them. And you can hear, as you said, you can hear and feel the results. You know, when you hear a big truck go down the street, or you hear somebody on in a really loud car, you know, is taking the muffler off so they can make as much noise as they can to prove their masculinity. You know, that's the brute force of fossil fuels. And energy, nature usually doesn't like to use energy in those kinds of ways. I mean, during a thunderstorm, yes, a hurricane, enormous amounts of energy get released very rapidly. But in ecosystems, nature likes to slow down the energy transfer as much as possible, so as to make the most of that energy. You know, a fully mature ecosystem uses every bit of energy in, you know, amazingly creative ways, the ways that organisms have adapted themselves to be able to use energy to do things, to do an amazing repertoire of things. We won't go into it. All you have to do is step outside and pay attention. But we have to do the same thing as we adapt to, again, to renewable sources of energy. Slow the energy down and find ways to use every bit of it in ways that not only make life, you know, practically functional, but also beautiful. Nature is not just about getting the job done. Nature is about beauty. Nature invests enormous amounts of resources deliberately in creating beauty. I mean, whether it's flowering plants or birds singing or whatever. I mean, this is not just human interpretation. I think that's beautiful. Well, that's just my interpretation. No, that's beautiful. And we humans can create a beautiful world again if we begin channeling our energy once again in ways that are, as you say, you know, elegant. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm speaking from a personal experience here. I've also been researching how to go from the state of depletion into sustainability and into the regenerative future, like in my own body, but also in my surroundings, and looking at the world as a whole, seeing that this is also happening on a global planetary scale. And I find it so beautiful that you're weaving in beauty. And for me, this is one of the kind of main tenets with the regenerative shift, is that we're starting to mirror the nature, the beauty of nature back into her, right? And it has a more feminine aspect to it. And I'm wondering if this is something that you can see, because you're in the middle of it all. You're standing in the kind of the core of the research being done now in fossil fuels and so on. And how present or how visible is this to you in your work, in your day to day?
Well, you know, I'm happy to say it's present for me personally, because my wife and I have made the effort over the last 30 years or so to build, you know, a permaculture abode. You know, we have, you know, 3 lovely chickens who give us eggs and garden beds, and fruit and nut trees and all the rest. And it's a little paradise.
Mm.
But outside of this, you know, we live in a world that is pretty ugly in many ways. And I think, unfortunately, likely to get more so over the short run as people begin to compete more and more for diminishing availability of energy and other resources. So I think it's important that we hold in our hearts that beauty that is innate, not just to we as human beings, but to all biological organisms that you know, with which we're dependent and ultimately in harmony, and keep that sacred, because that's what will get us through.
Mm. Wise words. I'll take a question from the audience here. So, how do economic models predicated on growth affect finding solutions? How can we decouple energy from growth? And
Mhm.
can we? I'm guessing this has to do with how we define growth.
Right. Well, growth is currently defined in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, or GNP, gross national product. And that's just a measure of how much money is flowing through an economy on an annual basis. And in virtually every case, if more money is flowing through an economy, that money ends up getting spent on products, resources, and energy. And so, you know, some economists have this idea that we can decouple economic growth from resource and energy usage so that we can have the economy still growing, producing more jobs and profits for investors and so on. Well, we're actually shrinking the amount of stuff we use. So far, that's never happened. And I think there are good reasons for assuming it never will happen. I think what we really need to do is demonetize the economy. You know, money is a substitute for a lot of things. It's a substitute for knowing one another and being willing to voluntarily help and give to each other. You know, in hunter-gatherer societies, there was no money. It was a gift economy. People just shared everything they had. Then once we invented money, see, economists have this crazy idea that money is just a neutral medium of exchange. No, money is social power. It enables some people to tell other people what to do. I mean, that's how it actually works in our lives. So if we don't like that kind of vertical power of having some people more powerful than others and telling them what they should do, that means we have to reduce the amount of money that's flowing through the economy. That means lowering GDP. Sounds like, if you're a conventional economist, that is a prescription for disaster. That's like the worst thing that could possibly happen. But you know, we just have to completely shift our economic models. Economics, as it's currently taught, is described as a science, but it's never been a science. It's a type of moral philosophy, and it's a moral philosophy that says it's okay for a person or a corporation to own land, and therefore all the resources on the land, and to extract the resources and profit from them. Future generations, other people, don't really matter. That's private property. How is that science? That's not science. That's a moral choice, and it's a moral choice that I happen to disagree with. So we have to start thinking very differently about economics, and we need an economics that puts nature at the center of it.
Absolutely. Every thought, word, deed, action. I think this is our last question. So we're going to close this cycle and this circle of talks with you, Richard. So thank you so much for joining us today and fueling our conversation with energy elegant solutions for the next paradigm of growing our new economy. Thank you so much for joining. And on behalf of the Systems Change Alliance, I would like to say goodbye for now.
Yeah, thank you and
Thank
be well.
you.
Mhm.